Hey everyone, as been mentioned, my name is Ron. I'm the lead pastor here at Vitalpoint Church, and it is awesome to be together today. I'm so grateful that you've taken the time. One of the things that I did last weekend, I spent some time in Exeter, one of our locations, and I just love going and visiting sites and locations of Vitalpoint Church. So shout out to Exeter. Make sure you give a big cheer for them. And I love meeting new people that are part of our church and also people that are familiar and have been part of it for a very, very long time. So this week is week 3 in our Exodus to Jesus series, and we're going to be focusing on a topic that I think is going to be difficult for some of us, but I believe that we'll be able to push through and find some hope and healing in the midst of it. We're going to be talking about shame, and I am going to share a story with you about shame in my life and how it reared its ugly head. So this series, Exodus to Jesus, has been looking at a story in the life of God's people in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. The story is about roughly 3,500 years old, and it's a story of how God shoulder taps Moses to lead his people, God's people, out of slavery from Egypt. He's going to rescue them. He's going to lead them. And what I love about this story and why it's such a critical story is that it foreshadows our understanding of Jesus and even our own lives. That is the beauty of the Bible. The Bible has this way of pointing us to understanding God, pointing us to Jesus, and it reveals stuff about ourselves. Now, if you've missed any of the series, I want to encourage you to go back, watch it on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to have extra about these topics, you can actually watch or listen to our Vital Moments where we interview the speaker of that weekend about the topic. With the exception of Thanksgiving weekend, we all took Monday off and didn't do the podcast. All right, so I want to look at this passage that was read for us and unpack it a little bit, and understanding how Moses finds himself in the wilderness and then finds himself in front of a bush that's not burning and God speaking to him. Like, how did this all come about? Well, we established the fact that Moses was born into an Israelite family, but yet was raised in the house of Pharaoh. It was of the day when the Pharaoh of the day was trying to stop the multiplication of God's people. So he put a decree that all male babies were to be thrown into the Nile River. Now, Moses' mom, when she gives birth to him, sees that he is special. Now, this is more than just the average special. Like every mom looks at their baby and thinks they're special. This was a unique situation where she realized there was something about this baby, and she hid him for a period of time. She got to the point where she couldn't hide him anymore. And so she makes a basket, floats him in the very river where he was supposed to be killed, but he's actually floating in the basket. And Pharaoh's daughter is down bathing, and she sees the basket, and she takes Moses in. For the first 40 years of Moses' life, he grows up in the home of Pharaoh, fully aware of the system that is oppressing his people. He's educated in Egypt. He has an understanding of the world through that lens. He's absorbed in everything around him. But he also witnesses the pain that the Pharaoh is causing his people. He has placed a burden upon them. Now, there's this interesting moment that reveals something about Moses, and I'm not sure if I've ever really paid attention to this before. It's verse 11. It says, one day when Moses had grown up, he was about 40, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Now, it says he went out and he looked upon the burdens of his people. This is not like he put out a lawn chair and had a pina colada with an umbrella in it and just sipping it, watching it. It wasn't doing that. There was something deep within him that moved him. There was something in his observation of the pain that Pharaoh was causing to his people. It moved him in a way that he wanted to do something about it. It's almost like he had compassion. Compassion is interesting. Compassion has this sense of trying to relieve the pressure or to lift a burden. Compassion doesn't just say, I'll pray for you and then move on. It wasn't like he was in his lawn chair sipping his drink with the umbrella saying, I'll pray for you guys. No, there was something inside of him that was stirring. See, He had the luxury of the palace, abundance of wealth. But Moses, deep down inside, observes what is happening and the pressure that he feels for his people. We must understand that there is something that he understood about himself. He would have probably heard the story over and over from Pharaoh's daughter. Moses, I rescued you from the Nile River. And there must have been something deep inside of him that he understood. I was born for a greater purpose. Moses observing, and he sees this opportunity to do something, to step in. Verse 12 says, he looked this way and that. So he's now going to take action. He looks to see if anyone is around, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses deliberately kills the man that was putting a burden, was beating one of his own people, and he tries to cover it up. I know this is hard for us to understand and grasp, but this reveals the very fact that Moses understands something about the reason he was saved from the Nile River. And in this moment, he's showing his people that there is a reason he is here. He's trying to demonstrate his purpose of being saved from the Nile River. It's interesting when you look at the Bible, you can actually cross-reference these things that better understand what's going on. Matter of fact, in the New Testament, there's this book called Acts. And in Acts, there's this disciple of Jesus named Stephen. And Stephen is actually the first martyr, the first Christian that lost his life for his commitment to Jesus. And in Acts chapter 7, he has this great message that he preaches, and he's going through the story of God's people. And he talks about Moses. Verse 25, he says, he supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. See, Moses' actions and his understanding was that he had a role to play. He wanted his people to know that I am here, that I'm going to deliver you, that I'm going to rescue you. But here's the issue. Moses had the right understanding, but he was doing it in his own power and in his own time. His heart was not right and his timing was off. Let me give you a small application to this, kind of apply it to our lives. We can be like Moses sometimes, right? Many of us can maybe sit with a stirring inside of us. We understand that maybe there's a greater purpose for our life than just the paycheck that we take home at the end of the day, or the office chair that we sit in, or the assembly line that we stand in putting things together. And we can have that stirring inside of us. And the danger sometimes is we try to force it, or we try to go ahead of what God actually has for us. There's this beautiful verse that I just so love in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. It says that we are God's masterpiece in Christ Jesus, created for good works. So if you're a follower of Jesus, there's a reality of the good works that God has assigned to you for you specifically. But here's the problem. Sometimes we try to force these things out of our own strength. We try to force these things out of our own timing. But truly what it means is that we are to walk in stride with Jesus. And as we do, we will discover his timing and his purpose and his good works for us that are assigned. And when they happen, it's like, oh, I know what this is. This is one of those moments that God has for me. And it comes from the striding, the walking, the abiding in a relationship with Jesus, so that when those moments happen, you discover what they are. See, Moses, he knew deep down that God would have him do something to rescue his people, but he did it in his own might, in his own strength, in his own timing. Now, what's interesting is the next day, he sees two of his people fighting. They're going at it. And he tries to step in. He tries to say, hey, what are you doing? You need to stop this. You should not be behaving this way. But word is spread. The word is spread that Moses has killed an Egyptian. And one of the guys turns to him and says, what? Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? And in that moment, Moses is filled with fear. And it's recorded for us that the Pharaoh hears what Moses has done and he tries to kill him. And Moses flees to the land of the Midianites and he sits down at a well. And at this well will be the beginning of the journey in the wilderness for Moses for 40 years. For the next 40 years, Moses will live in the wilderness. He'll get married, he'll have children, he'll become strong in the land as a shepherd. His life was in the palace, life of luxury, and now he's a shepherd in the wilderness. This is where God shows up in an ordinary day. See, in the ordinary moment, Moses is walking by this bush. How many times has he passed that bush? Probably many times. And then he sees that it's burning, but it's not burning up. And in his curiosity, he goes over to it. And as he approaches it, God speaks to him, Moses, Moses. And in that moment, he begins to interact with Moses and begins to reveal to him the very thing that Moses had felt for the first 40 years of his life, that he was going to go and deliver and rescue God's people from slavery. The dream of rescuing them has come to be, but yet in the midst of this moment, he genuinely doesn't get what God is asking him to do. Look at verse 11. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? At 40, he's what? He's ready to go. At 80, his posture is different. Who am I? God, are you sure? Do you not remember that I murdered somebody? I can't go back there. They will remember what I did. Now, before we address what changed, we need to address something about God here, because the story is revealing us something about God's heart. God asks Moses to go and lead his people out of Egypt because God didn't see Moses through the lens of his past. He saw him in the midst of the wilderness, but he looked beyond that to understand who he could become as a leader. It's not that God overlooked his past, but he would understand that his past can be used for God's purposes, right? Now, show of hands. How many of you, if you were God, would choose someone who took the life of another person to go and rescue your people? Show of hands. Come on. Some of us are putting our hands in the air, right? I would. I'd put my hand there. I wouldn't choose that person. It's a good thing we're not God, right? Because God chose Moses. He chose him. Even though Moses had a past failure, had sin, from a human perspective, he's unqualified for what he had done. But God goes to Moses and repurposes his life. That's the beauty and the wonder of God, that we are never, ever beyond the second opportunity of God stepping in to our lives and giving us that second chance. No matter how ugly our past is, no matter how colorful it is, no matter how many bad choices and decisions we have made, God can still repurpose it. Now, Moses, what changed, right? What changed? Well, the answer is, I think, pretty clear. Moses had allowed shame to become his identity, right? Moses had allowed shame to become his identity. Moses, for 40 years, had been replaying what he had done. For the 40 years of shame had defined his life. What he thought was the right thing ended up crippling him in the end. And only he could imagine the shame and the depth that he had felt in that moment and the life that he had lived, because shame began to reshape his identity. And that is how Moses saw his life. When I was putting this together, I was thinking about Rob Reimer, Dr. Rob Reimer. It's a books that we read, Soul Care and Soul Care Leader and so on, Spiritual Authority. It's books that many of us have read as staff and senior leadership. He says this about shame. Shame is a deep-seated feeling of unworthiness or inadequacy that stems from past experiences, failures, and trauma. Shame can distort our identity and hinder our relationship with God and others. It's a deep-seated feeling of unworthiness and inadequacy that stems from past experiences, failures, and trauma. I told you I was going to share a story from my life. And I could probably pick a number of stories from my life where shame has taken part and has taken root in my life and it shaped my identity. But I want to share one with you where it reared its ugly head in a moment where I actually found myself in a very tough situation. So it was a few years ago, many years ago. I was invited to the president's home of a very well-known seminary. And seminary is that place where people go and get their education to become pastors. As I was in this event, in this gathering, I realized that I was surrounded by some extremely intelligent, educated human beings that had lots of letters behind their names. I began feeling very unworthy, uncomfortable, and I tried to avoid as many conversations as possible. I just kind of sat in the corner by myself. But inevitably, you're going to have to cross paths. And in this one moment, I was standing in line. I can remember, I can see the table for the food. I can see my plate. I was half full. And there was a guy, a pastor, standing beside me. And he said, "So, Ron, what seminary did you go to?" And it was in this moment, I had to figure out what to do because I didn't go to seminary. And so I kind of played it out that, oh, you wouldn't know what it is. It's actually a small school in New Brunswick in Canada. I was in the States at the time at this meeting. And so it's in Canada. It's a small school. And I played it off as if it was a seminary. And yes, maybe a form of a lie, sure. But it was really a moment where I was so crippled with shame. Because I don't have letters behind my name. I don't have the education that these guys all had. And I got a certificate at the end of 3 years of Bible college saying, you did it, you finished. And in this moment, I really felt the shame of my education. On top of that, I didn't feel as smart as these people. I didn't feel worthy to be at the table. And shame had shaped my identity. Now, I'm many years past that. And nowadays, if that were to happen, I wouldn't give a rip because I'm in my 50s. And when you get in your 50s, you just don't give a rip anymore, right? And so I would have been fine with just saying, oh, I didn't go to seminary. And for me, it was just this realization of what shame was doing. It really shaped my life. And then this thought had hit me this week. Shame resides, maybe this will land for you. Shame resides in the narratives we tell ourselves. Right? Ultimately shaping our identity and hindering us from fulfilling the good works we were created to accomplish. See, guilt will make us feel bad for what we've done. Shame begins to shape our identity. Moses' shame had ruled the story of his life. His failure had defined him. But I think it's important to notice something about God here as well. Beyond just the fact that he shoulder tapped him, to be the leader, to lead God's people and rescue them from Egypt. There's this beautiful moment where God reveals something to Moses. He said to him, "But I will be with you. And this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." See what God does? God doesn't look at Moses and give him a pep talk. God doesn't look at Moses and say, "You got this, Moses. I believe in you. You got this. Buddy, your past is your past. Just move on." No, he actually God assures Moses of his presence. "I will be with you." Why? Because if Moses can realize God's presence, his story changes from shame to security in God's promise. And that will give him the confidence to eventually step into the moment that God has for him. See, when we understand the power of God's presence, the chains of shame are unlocked and a story begins to be rewritten. Think about my encounter with that pastor. Had asked me what seminary I went to. My shame was caught up in what? The story that I had told myself. The story of my Bible college education. I'm unqualified. I'm insecure. But now I've redefined my story, not based on the letters behind my name, but based on the fact of God's presence in my life, calling me to be the pastor of Vitalpoint at this particular moment. That's a powerful shift. What is God doing for Moses? Giving him a new identity that's rooted in God's understanding of Moses, not in the story Moses had been telling himself for 40 years. See, Moses had to get his eyes off of his failure and get his eyes on the reality of God's presence. See, one of the major themes that we see in the scriptures, in the Bible, is that God is a genius at rewriting the stories. We actually see this in the life of Jesus. Jesus, over and over and over again, would encounter people. They would come into his presence and they would leave changed. They would understand the power of what it meant to be not only in his presence, but to orient their lives around him and allowing him to be their security, to be their identity in him. there's this powerful moment that's familiar to some people. It's in John chapter 4. And this John chapter 4 moment it's referred to as the woman at the well. It's we never get the name of this woman. She's just referred to as the woman at the well. And she is there at noon. And it's interesting. She's there because she's not welcomed earlier in the day when it's cooler around the other people because of the life that she's lived. And they loved to pour shame on her. And she was living from that place of shame. So she would go at the hottest point of the day and she would get water from this well. And Jesus intentionally walks in her path to meet her. And in this moment, he has this conversation with her about water. Jesus is brilliant at using the cultural moment that he's standing in. Whatever it is, he can draw out the illustration. And at this well with water, Jesus says this powerful thing to her as he begins to redefine her story. It's found in John chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again." I can just picture him pointing at the well. "But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Jesus offers this woman an internal reality of a well of water that would spring up to eternal life, that would begin to redefine her story, to show her a new way to live. That shame no longer has to dictate how she was to live her life. See, the Exodus to Jesus moment is for us, for you and for me. See, some of us today can identify with Moses. We look at our past and we can see the ugliness of it. We can think about this woman at the well who carried that shame. You know, there's some of us that are listening to my voice right now that have a failed marriage because of unfaithfulness and the shame that you have felt from that. Or the shame that you feel that you're not smart enough. Or the shame that you feel because you can, kick your addictive patterns for a season, but like a dog going back to its vomit, you continue to return to the addictive patterns and behaviors and you're filled with so much shame. Or maybe you are in the dark depths of depression and you're just like, I'm a follower of Jesus, but I just can't seem to break this pattern of mental illness. And for whatever reason, I live my life from a place of shame. Or you've mismanaged your money and you're under an enormous amount of debt. Or maybe there's been some form of abuse in your past and it's defined the narrative of your life. It's destroying you. What if we today understood something different about God? That God, through the person of Jesus Christ, actually wants to enter into our story and rewrite that shame narrative. Please hear me on this. I want you to lean in as much as you can in this moment. Jesus doesn't want to give you 5 tips to overcome the shame. He wants to come into the shame and to deal with it. This is the reality of what the Bible teaches about being in Christ and Christ being in us, is that we don't go to him and just kind of get him to wave a wand over our shame and it go away. No, he wants to be in the midst of it with us so that he can bring healing, so that he can begin to rewrite it, that he can begin to forgive the past and rewrite that shame narrative with a new story, with his story in the midst of it. See, Jesus took our shame on himself. He took our sin on himself. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. It says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that as set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. We look to Jesus. He is the one who's the founder and the perfecter. He is the one that brings the new story. He is the one that gives us a new identity. He is the one that had great joy as he faced the torment of the cross and the shame of that moment because he knew what was on the other side. It's like God knew what was on the other side of Moses' life if he could just get the new story and allow the shame to be turned down in his life. Jesus endured the cross and he took our shame upon himself That shame as he hung there on the cross in front of the crowds of people, public, naked, exposed. It was the shame that he took for us. This is the healing power of the cross. This is the healing power of what Jesus offers us today. Our mission as a church is to point people to Jesus and walk with them as they become fully devoted followers of him. Today, if your life is filled with shame, if the shame has dictated your relationships and how you see life, and it's rewritten things in your life that is only bringing destruction, I want you to know today that God deeply loves you. That God deeply loves you through the person of Jesus Christ, and he wants to give you a new story. Why? Because God is the master storyteller. I love what God did with Moses. He says, Moses, I want you to go back and I want you to lead my people. I want you to lead them out of slavery, out of Egypt. And he promises him that he will be with him. I think today, one of the realizations is that we can step into this promise. We can get our eyes off of ourselves and look to God, look to the person of Jesus Christ, and allow him to begin the process. Yes, hear me on this. Some of you are like, Ron, it sounds so simple and so easy to do, but it's so extremely difficult. Yes, because here's the thing. When we enter into that relationship with Christ, what that means is we abide in him. We walk into his stride. We begin to understand more of his life in our lives and our lives in him. And what that happens is it's a process of stripping down those things in our lives that control us and rebuilding. It's not that the things in the past will be gone and you'll forget them. No, it's the reality of how he reshapes them and can use them for his purposes. I think of the power of that and the beauty of that. So many of us spend so much time trying to overcome these things, but yet it is entering into the process. It's a fancy word is sanctification. It's this process of the Spirit in us, reworking, redesigning. And sure, there might be moments where you have to sit with someone and talk these things through. Find that person. But yet in understanding, it begins with a relationship with Jesus. I love the fact that God gets Moses' attention. And maybe today, God is trying to get your attention and to say, that shame no longer has to be your identity. Will you let me be your identity? Will you let me begin to take care of the shame in my life?